that's not natural for them or as natural for them. It's like, I have my dream, my vision. Why would I, like, the only reason that I try to communicate this to other people is so that I can accomplish something, right? But, you know, with the SFPs and NTJs, they often, especially, you know, classic notion with the INTJ, they don't like having to teach other people things because they get frustrated that the other person just doesn't see what is so obvious to them. Similar thing with the ISFP, whereas the INFJ doesn't have that problem. If anything, they almost get a satisfaction out of figuring out how to translate what was personal into what is understandable from somebody else who hasn't had those experiences. So you get that sense of translation with the INFJ. INFPs are tricky, but because they do have a sense of, more of a sense of translation, but like I talked about in the live stream, the INFP is more linked up with what I'd call the merchants, or in the playing card scenario with the pyramid. They are trying to individuate everybody. The clergy is trying to get everybody on the same page, right? The INFJ is specifically trying to get everybody onto the same page and to agree on the same central concepts and to say, listen, what you believe is not really so different from what I believe. Here's the similarities. And they're trying to get everybody to align on the same line or to unite at the top of the pyramid. But the INFP is trying to do the opposite, where they're like, they'll understand, or they'll perceive universally, they'll perceive in terms of universals what they believe everybody else is thinking, or, you know, what generally everybody else is doing, but then they want to help people to individuate themselves from that. It's like Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, where he talks about Abraham ascending Mount Moriah, and he goes on and on about the notion that Abraham is now making himself unintelligible to other people because he's leaving the ethical. If you read Fear and Trembling, it's a perfect insight into the INFP philosophy, because it's all about, he presupposes that the ethical is he talks about the ethical realm, which is his version of FETI. It's universal ethics that everybody's able to understand. But he says if you want to be truly religious, then you have to transcend that, and you have to enter a realm that is no longer something that you can communicate to others. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about that, the NFP-STJ mentality and how it differs from the NFJ, because the NFJ, that's not how they think. They want, because they start with what is incommunicable and they're trying to make it communicable. So they're always descending Mount Moriah. They've already killed Isaac, in a sense, and they're trying to justify why they killed Isaac. Whereas the NFPs start not having killed Isaac, but they're trying to, they're essentially trying to get themselves to find what is something that I can do that is the equivalent of killing Isaac, something that is truly me, that is me, and no one else can put a label on it, because then I know that it's something that is truly my own. It's my own FI desire that I've gone forth. I think I'm done with that question. I hope that helps at least. I've gone everywhere, but we're going to take forever, aren't we? The next question is, could you talk more about NI? And I just kind of did a ton about NI and how it relates to others, but if anything, I would emphasize that notion that it really is you optimizing on the data that you have from where you're standing at a given point. It's like what John Barnes had said to me, that from his observation was that NESI, or at least NE, but I think as they go together, you give them a problem and they're always going to try to expand the data sets. They always want to get more universal and say, well, I'm not going to just... they just naturally will say, well, I have no idea what is going on right in front of me. I can't trust what's going on in front of me right now, so I'm going to circumvent that by getting data sets that are like on the other side of it. Or it's hard for me to describe because I just don't think this way, but they're looking for universal methods or for things that will help to circumvent the here and now. It's a lot of philosophers, INTPs especially, like Descartes is like, I'm not going to trust my senses. I'm going to meditate and doubt everything around me and figure out what is my methodology for circumventing my sense impressions. Whereas NI works with SE, and always, it's a great example is Hegel. In the beginning of Phenomenology of Spirit, he critiques Kant, the INTP, by saying that Kant starts out his question by trying to say whether, what is the proper way to use our mind, right? That's not quite how he puts it, but he says Hegel basically says you can't start this by doubting whether or not anything can be known or not, because the only way that you'd know that nothing can be known is you'd still know it, right? Right? Like, the point being that what Kant does is, he says that the noumena cannot be apprehended because we see everything through all these SI filters. And Hegel is saying, I'm butchering this. It was so clear in my head, but I'm having trouble translating it. Let me start over briefly. What Kant was saying is that Hegel criticizes Kant because Kant starts out by doubting whether or not anything can be known, and Hegel says, well, that's ridiculous. Hegel understands why Kant might do that for the most part, but he says, if we're going to do philosophy, you have to start somewhere. That's sort of the SENI mentality. You have to start somewhere with your observations, so it might as well be wherever you're happening to stand at the moment. And Hegel's attempt is to try to reconcile himself with Kant by saying, you have to start somewhere. You can't start in this no man's land. That's how he would see it, in this sort of universalized no man's land. You have to start with SE, with where you are right now, and work the matter out from there, and gradually work your way through the concepts to having a truly universalized experience. But that point is that he says you've got to start in the here and now, and with what your sense experience is in fact telling you. And then what happens is, through the process, you figure out that your sense experience is not sufficient in specific ways, and then you work with those directly. And so it's this very different. Kant is starting all the way out here in this thing, this universal that he's posited, and Hegel always starts way down here. I don't know if that makes sense. That doesn't quite directly answer the question, but it's a little bit more on NI. I guess I've been kind of emphasizing that notion that the perfect example is that the live stream yesterday, I was really focused and emphasizing that notion of trying to isolate the central thing that you want to communicate as being this big NI thing, and I'm almost completely forgotten about that now. It doesn't have the same impetus or strength in my mind right now. I've moved on to other things. It doesn't mean that I've recounted it. It just means that my mind is actually more in the moment than it might seem. And I'll go back over different themes, but it's a lot like Hegel. Things develop themselves. And it's also kind of how I'm communicating right now. I'll get a thought, and it's like, oh, that's a really good one. Let me communicate that. and sometimes I'm not very satisfied because it's like the thought that I tucker out or something. Like in the thought that I had, I'm like, oh, that's not quite as, or I lose track of what is going on. I keep on interrupting myself, and I know that's frustrating because I go back through and I listen to some of my videos and I'm like, wow, yeah, not my scripted videos, but the ones where I'm ranting, and I'm like, wow, yeah, I keep on cutting myself off. This can be hard to follow, because sometimes I don't complete my full thought because I'm like, no, wait, because I'll feel myself starting to tucker out with what I'm saying. I don't want to embarrass myself, so I interpose it with a better way that I feel like of saying it. And I'm speaking so fast because I'm trying to make sure that I keep up with the, before the ideas fade. And I use language, or I use sort of sets of phrases and I stick them together. But I think if you really listen, you'll notice that the phraseology that I use often will break grammar a little bit. And I think people do this a lot. But I'm breaking grammar a lot, and I'm interposing, and things are getting stuck in because I'm using whole phrases rather than individual words. I don't know. That's just an observation at the moment. You probably don't care about that. What did you major in, and what are you doing now? This is Katie Anderson. Oh, and the last question was the MGS 5012. The MAGS 5012? Anyway. Katie Anderson asks, what did you major in and what are you doing now? Well, I'll answer a bit of that. I try to stay a bit away from my personal life, but I majored in philosophy, well, it was technically philosophy and the humanities, but my focus was on the philosophy. And right now, that was just as an undergraduate, as a jumping off point. I'm still figuring out precisely, I don't regret it. I knew going into it that it was not, also because it's an undergraduate and I'm not going for an undergraduate that's going to get me a job immediately. I wanted something that I could use as a jumping off point for other things. Because I'm not, anyway. I don't know if I actually really want to be a philosophy professor, both because it's not very, I don't feel like that would be the wisest decision for supporting myself and a family. But anyway, that's just me. But as for what I'm doing right now, I'm actually working as a transcriptionist. I type really fast, and I'm typing what is said in classrooms for deaf students, and so the details aren't that important, but that's what I'm doing. So actually, I'm at a college campus right now, and I just finished up. I'm only working part-time right now, but I just finished up a class with working with a student in early morning class, and so I figured I would come here to my car where it's private, and I would set up things, and I would try to finish this up, because I knew that I would feel more comfortable. I always feel more comfortable talking when I'm alone. So I understand why people will often record videos in their car. So that's essentially what I'm doing right now. But that's more of just to earn money. And I'm in a situation where I'm able to focus on saving money, which is very, very good for me. So when it comes to dominant introverts, this is DYK winning 2. When it comes to dominant introverts, I have heard the concept. They interact with the world through their auxiliary extroverted function. Is this accurate? I'm assuming an auxiliary extroverted judging type gets used in conjunction far more with dominant introverted perceiving function than a perceiving auxiliary with dominant introverted judging. What are your thoughts? Very interesting question. Yeah. I've heard this too. It goes back to the problem that I talked about a bit in the live stream, that I don't currently have I don't have a clear enough system, or a system that I feel has really been tested well enough, just in experience, for what precisely the function stack is supposed to mean, or how the different functions, depending on their preferredness, how they're actually supposed to interact with each other. I mean, the thing I've been leaning more towards is the focus on the function axes, which I'm a big fan of, obviously. I really like the function axes and them as a notion, and I feel like it helps logically to clear up some confusion. It helps to explain why certain functions always appear together, why you're not going to get ni and si in... They don't operate together. They're not conceptually commensurable. Ni and se, however, as concepts, are not just commensurable, but they're inseparable in my view. They're two sides of the same coin. Ni and si, same with any and se and all the others. So the trouble is that I want to say the classic model, the classic four-function model, where it's dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior, I use that a lot because I think they've hit on some important concepts and how these things interact, and I think it's right, but I don't feel like, I've come to feel like I don't understand it well enough, or what the justification is. Not the justification, but just precisely how these functions interact with each other and what's really going on. I mean, it's easy enough to say, well, it's just a degree to which they're preferred, but I don't think that's quite right, because that implies that the relationship is purely quantitative. And it's just a matter of, well, the dominant function appears 80% of the time or we would expect that to be the case if we could somehow design a test that would actually be able to test for that, which I'm not, someone will need to do that. But, you know, as anyone knows, a lot of the just pure function tests have a lot of trouble because they're testing for individual functions, and so you don't get traditional stacks. You get just a trait test. But anyway, so that's not really answering the question. The question is, do you act through the auxiliary function? And the answer is I can't really say, because I don't know what the specific relationship is. Right now it's still kind of wishy-washy, foggy-woggy, as it were. But I know where you're coming from, because I've thought that exact same thought a number of times before, especially I'm assuming an auxiliary extroverted judging type gets used in conjunction far more with dominant introverted perceiving function, right? Because there's that notion that, and I think it's true, that judging is more associated with action. I think though I think I'm wrong-headed in suggesting that they're like the same thing or anything, because they're not. But it's an easier way to try to describe what you actually mean by judging if you associate it more with action and being more active and going out there. So those are my thoughts. Not very conclusive, but I'm still I'm a bit up in the air about it. Do you put any weight into the concept of visual typing? This is Samantha Brook, or Brooks, but with a 5 instead of an S. Do I put any weight in the concept of visual typing via facial expressions and physical gestures? I've started to see an increase in content mentioning this. I have as well. Yet it mostly seems anecdotal so far. Curious to hear your thoughts. Yeah, well, I mean, I've talked a great deal about it in the last video. The only thing I'll repeat is I'm just waiting to see, because I understand I understand it. I've found that I think in a lot of ways, unconsciously use it. I think a lot of us unconsciously use it, and that's why it's a very powerful tool or notion. But like Celebrity Types posted a very good comment, as usual, on my live stream video, where they responded to a couple of the points, and I'm thankful they did that. But they talked a little bit about cognitive types too, just briefly. Mainly about the notion of why does cognitive types and IDR labs differ a lot. And, I mean, and I'd said about as much in the video anyway, but the point being that it's a matter of these different systems, that IDR labs is working, frankly, just off of different criteria and definitions than cognitive type. And if they're not aligning, then really what it comes down to is that if cognitive, assuming, and I have no reason to doubt that cognitive types is being very consistent and observant in what they're looking for, that they are noticing these constellations of facial expressions and body movements that seem to correspond to something, the question is whether or not the things that the visual typing corresponds to is the same thing that IDR Labs is trying to detect through non-visual typing methods, through analyzing the content of what's being said and written and so forth. So really the question is whether or not I think both of them are finding stuff, and I think that it is incorrect or wrong-headed to say that they ought to be agreeing on what types people are, because that's actually absurd, because clearly they're using different criteria to find, ultimately, I think, different things. They see constellations or patterns, and so they link those together, but they're ultimately looking, I think, for different things. And so if a person, this is problematic, of course, because the goal is to try to provide an objective basis for saying so-and-so is this type or so-and-so is that type. It's an attempt to find an easier way and a more, not just easier, and not even necessarily easier, but a more sure foundation for saying so-and-so is this type, so-and-so is that type. We can say it objectively and we can prove it given these factors, which is a very good idea to try, and I think they're doing good work there. But the real question is whether or not, and I think this is the question that will come up, is whether or not whether or not you can, for instance, I think I've already said it, but IDR Labs and cognitive types, and IDR Labs said that basically some of the typings from cognitive type, there is no way that they would arrive to that conclusion through their own system. And they're right, because I took another look at it, and yeah, I mean, I gave the Sam Harris example, which I think, technically they agree on, but there are a number of other cases where it's like, no, there isn't really any way to for them to compromise. So it's interesting. I'm watching to see what happens. I think, like I've said, I've got a lot of respect, and I've got a lot of, I'm excited to see what happens, and I think that they're doing good things. But I've already kind of talked it to death a bit. But if I were to summarize, probably the important notion would be, can't remember what the important notion was. Sorry. That it would be this. It would be that whether or not what Celebrity Types is trying to find can in fact be, can you link that up with facial typings? Or is what Cognitive Types observing revealing a whole different set of revelations about a person's subjective experience? That's essentially what I'm saying, is that IDR Labs is looking for things that they don't believe can be relied upon to produce certain facial expressions in a way that could be objectively found. So it's not inconsistent for them to say that Cognitive Types is finding stuff, but the question is whether or not they're finding the same thing that IDR Labs is trying to find, because they are using different methods and so forth. So a person could be a type by RDR Labs, but they could be a different type by cognitive type. You know, they could have a different philosophical type than, as opposed to, you could say, their external phenotype and the associated internal things the cognitive type finds out. But anyway, we gotta wait and see. I am standing back on this. I'm being Jeffersonian. Gosh dang it. Okay, moving right along. Sorry, just need to move right through. This might seem trivial, but I've observed consistencies in the MBTI type's preferences and personal interests in regard to music, theater, and art. I do believe that knowing this information usually gives some insight in the person's personality characteristics and values. Do you think this is a valid observation, that depending on your MBTI type, you're likely to share similar interests and preferences as others with the same or similar types? I'd be really interested in hearing your opinion. Also, what are your top 3 favorite bands? Well, I'll get to the top 3 favorite bands in a bit. But, so as for the, the correlation between type and interest in art, like I've said before, it's a matter of, the thing is that it's very problematic. I think that there are constellations that you'll find that in say Western society in general, or at least American society, that certain types will be, it's unsurprising that a particular type will like a certain kind of music, and that you'll see that happening over and over. And I guess, but the thing that I would be wary of, and if I'm being honest, I think it gets to the heart of the potential trouble that I might have with the facial typing, comes down to the notion that while you can see consistencies, external empirical consistencies, I get nervous when those are taken to because I'm TI. I'm very TI thinking, and so I get nervous when the external measurable results are mistaken for what's actually going on underneath. I didn't explain that very well, so let me try again. So, for instance, if you find that INFPs, that everybody who you know who's INFP, all of them like David Bowie. I'm not saying this is true, but let's just say that you did find that empirically. The trouble is that if you then say via induction, essentially, that, okay, therefore all INFPs like David Bowie, and you could then go ahead and make a type test, and one of the questions would be, do you like David Bowie? And if you like David Bowie, then it's like, very likely now that you're INFP. I get very nervous about that, right? Because I'm like, and it makes sense, and if you did find a strong enough correlation, then I ought to be able to go along with it. But I get nervous because in my mind, the first thought that I think is, well, what if there's an INFP out there who doesn't like David Bowie? And the thing is that it's just a different way of approaching it. Because the one side is saying, well, the definition of INFP is they've made it inductive. That the definition becomes somebody who likes David Bowie because we found this large group of people who like David Bowie. And so it's much more useful and utilitarian, it's much more TEFI, I think, to make that the definition, than to take this anti-utilitarian view, which is FETI, and say, no, it doesn't matter it doesn't matter if it so happens that at a given point in time you see lots of people who are INFP and also like David Bowie. That's still just a coincidence. What's important is figuring out what makes those people INFP on the inside. What is the internal principle that is not going to change depending on social circumstances and so forth, that is not subject to those things, that we can get at and try to find. That it's a major difference, I think, between TE and TI. And I obviously lean more towards the TI because I always get wary of trying to define things in that sort of inductive way. So that's a roundabout way of saying that while I agree that there are consistencies, there's definitely consistencies between type and preference in art, music, or theater, and so forth. I always hesitate to say that is definitional of a type. I always maintain that it is an interesting coincidence that could be tracked down to the specific way that what really makes the type that type, the function axes and the philosophical preferences, the way that those interact with external conditions is what has produced this current trend. But the trend may change as the external conditions in society change. The benefit to, say, facial typing is that it doesn't have anything to do with society, at least that we know of. It's trying to circumvent that, and it's trying to find a more of a middle. Let me just check something. Okay, I'm still good. Yeah, and it's recording. So it's trying to say, because it's getting at biology, or it's trying to get at biology by saying these are things that you don't think about, that you do, like nervous tics and facial expressions and things that are hardwired into your human biology and therefore can be tracked back through evolution, which is a smart notion. And so that's why a lot of I'm very interested in what they're going to do and are doing. So, I mean, like I've said, please check that out and take a look at what they're doing, because there's a lot I think you can learn. But yeah, so do I think it's a valid observation? Well, yeah, I agree with you. I think that definitely crops up. The question is whether or not that is what makes a type an INFP, and I don't think so. I don't think that an INFP, and that's a part of why I often get irritated with tests sometimes, because I'm always thinking to myself, well, this is, what if I just so happen to be an INFJ who doesn't like this particular thing, or who, because of, the unique